This was recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and the Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation.
Ay, mijo, cuando camines por la calle, con la pesadumbre de los nombres que no te pertenecen.
When you walk down the street with the heaviness of names that do not belong to you.
Recuerda que fuiste hecha de mujeres que han pintado flores en el rostro de calaveras por generaciones.
Remember you were made from women who have been painting flowers on the faces of skulls for years.
Welcome to Stories of Coming Out and Coming Home, where we share everyday stories of families from our culturally and linguistically diverse communities on the journey of embracing their LGBTQ+ loved ones. Showing how their support and embrace strengthens family bonds, strengthens cultural connection, and enables them to thrive and flourish. Stories of belonging told in our own words, our own languages, shared with our communities. Stories of coming out and coming home.
My name is Asiladan Sanchez. I was born in Jojutla, Morelos, Mexico. I identify as non-binary and queer. My pronouns are they, them.
And you're also a doctor, a GP who works and specializes in sexual health, transgender and gender diverse healthcare, and a published poet, a real Renaissance figure, I think, which we'll chat more about later. But first, I want to say how pleased I am that you and your family is the first participants in this community storytelling project. We met each other through a bit more than a year ago through your partner, Tony.
Yes.
Who's also a longtime friend of mine. He's actually introduced me to a lot of people in the queer Asian community in Sydney as well. And for a while I heard a lot about you, but haven't met you because you were living mostly in Melbourne at that time.
That's right.
And I think we properly got to know each other when Tony brought you to the premiere of my film last year,
Yes.
I think. And I think we were both straight away felt like there was a lot of commonality between us. And because we kind of both work in a more science-based field, you being a doctor and I'm an engineer, but then we also spend a lot of our time and energy on our artistic pursuits, but also the area that we both explore, that intersectional experience of being from diaspora community and being queer. Now, before we go too deep into your poems, I want to hear more about your experience growing up, discovering your sexuality and your gender identity, and how it related to the cultures that you were brought up in. Because I actually don't think I've ever found out that full story from you.
Yeah, that's a really good question and something that I keep exploring and re-exploring and kind of coming back to and making sense of. Partly because a lot of the discourse around coming out and gender and sexuality is very westernized and very anglicized. So I feel like it has taken time for me to actually be able to integrate these two aspects of myself and where they came from and what cultural elements informed them. And I think for a very long time I was really distanced from my cultural background and heritage, and I had this notion or this feeling that I could be one or the other, but not both.
Did you find that when you were growing up in Mexico as well as here?
Yeah, that's right. And I think in Mexico, it's changed a lot, I think, nowadays, but I felt like when I was growing up, everything was unspoken. So there was queerness around, and queerness that perhaps I could also recognize, but it was very unspoken. There's the world famous Juan Gabriel, who when he was asked about his sexuality and his queerness, he just replied, "What's seen so obviously, it doesn't have to be stated. You know, it could just be out in silence and could exist without being kind of spoken about.
Like people recognized it without being spoken out, explicitly spoken about.
Yeah, that's right. And that obviously clashed a lot with, again, Western notions of, you know, coming out and pride and being visible and being out there and et cetera, et cetera. So it took quite a bit of time for me to reconcile those two elements. And I remember the first time going back to Mexico after being, I think,
When did you come to migrate to Australia?
We arrived in 2007. So at that stage, I was 17, almost 18. So I had, let's say, all my formative years and childhood and youth and growing up was very much based in Mexico.
And did you kind of already have a good understanding of your sexuality and your gender identity when you were in Mexico?
I don't think I did. No, I don't think I did. I remember feeling like the penny dropped, like quite literally, as soon as we moved into Australia, and just waking up one day and going like, oh, okay, that's what that is, and that's what it means.
And were you still in high school at that point?
I was, yeah. I think I must have been in year 12 at that stage, so fairly late in the piece. Yeah.
What about when you were younger and you mentioned how there was that, is that a Mexican artist that said, were you aware of that when you were a child in Mexico?
No, not in the sense that I wasn't, let's say, I didn't see myself within that narrative, I suppose. That was something that
you were aware of that existing within the Mexican
Yeah,
culture.
that's right. Because of course, as like a young person, you just don't clock it necessarily. Even though there's something there that you identify with, it was just this kind of vague, unspoken thing that felt familiar, but I couldn't express why or how. You know.
That's interesting because for me, I was born in Hong Kong and I moved to Australia when I was 8. And what was really interesting is there's a lot of this discourse out there that says, oh, it's a Western idea that's introduced to a lot of us diaspora communities. But for me, actually, it's funny because in Hong Kong growing up, there is this term for gay people is just called same-sex affair, literally.
Yeah.
So when you hear it, you automatically know what it means and no one needs to explain to you what it is.
Yes. Yeah.
And people talk about it. So for me, the language was always there, not because of the English or Australian or Western background, but for me, because of like the Cantonese or Chinese generally language, I had language for it very early on, and it was completely not because of Western influence. So yeah, it's interesting to hear kind of that difference between your experience and my experience. So you were aware of kind of this existence of queerness within the Mexican culture, not necessarily that you identified with it or you thought you were part of it.
Yeah, that's right. It was very, very vague. Again, it felt familiar in a way, but I couldn't tell you why it felt familiar, you know?
Yep.
It was just kind of there.
Did you feel like when you came to Australia, you kind of felt when you were exposed to the language around queerness or LGBTQ issues, that's why you explored it a bit more? Or was it because of an internal thing that you're mentally or physically, it was just something you had to explore because of that?
I think coming to Australia and finding kind of LGBTQIA plus communities here gave me a language that I didn't have access to necessarily in Mexico and Spanish. So it was definitely, let's say, an entry point. The thing that I came to realize as time went by is that that entry point and that language didn't make space for the other elements of myself, the cultural aspects of myself. What was there in Mexico that I still very much missed and very much loved. And all of a sudden I found myself removed from or alienated from because, you know, a lot of the queer community here in both Melbourne and Sydney are just very kind of white spaces.
Yes. Yeah, I definitely know where you're coming from with that. And definitely for the Chinese community, diaspora community especially, I think even more so than the Chinese queer experience back in Asia, is that it feels more like queerness is a Western thing, completely not related to your to your Chineseness. Yeah. But just coming back to that period of time, how long do you think it took you to kind of realize your sexuality or gender identity, and before you could really kind of confirm to yourself, that's who I am?
Not very, in the sense that once I had once the penny dropped, I realized that that's what it was, and that's what that kind of word or concept kind of spoke to my experience. And then it was just a matter of like, yes, okay, that's what it is. I didn't necessarily have a period of struggling with myself. It was more, funnily enough, struggling with other people's perception of me. Because again, growing up both in Mexico and in Australia, I had this sense that I didn't quite belong, or I moved, or I expressed myself in a way that wasn't necessarily expected of masculinity. And I felt that, again, alienation or separation or judgment.
This was back in Mexico.
Yeah, that's right, back in Mexico, and I guess even here as well. And I couldn't quite understand why. But once I understood, there wasn't any resistance, let's say internally, to say, okay, that's queer or whatever else it might be. The self-acceptance, I think, came pretty easily once I had the language to express it. And same for, let's say, the gender side of things. Once I realized that, let's say all aspects of myself included, feminine aspects and masculine aspects across. I embraced those fairly quickly, and I allowed myself to express them regardless of what other people thought. So, like doing makeup or engaging in feminine dress or engaging in feminine ways of expression was very natural to me. What again came more of a challenge was trying to figure out why other people didn't see that as a natural way of being or a default way of being, I suppose.
Would you say your upbringing or your childhood was quite free in terms of gender expression that contributed to this kind of ease that you had?
No, definitely not. I think I grew up in a fairly gendered and kind of traditional environment because we're from a fairly small town in Mexico. We're not from, let's say, any big cities or particularly any progressive areas of Mexico. And I do recall multiple instances of being corrected for how I express myself or how I moved. Or
was that from within your family? Or?
Yeah, that's right. And
I noticed a few poems that kind of refer to that experience.
Yeah, that's right, and let's say friends as well. But this was when I was young, and I didn't understand why that was the case. Again, to me, it was a very natural way of being. So I couldn't understand why that was wrong. I just understood or felt that it was wrong, but I couldn't have told you why.
Did that cause like a bit of anguish or despair or hurt when you experienced that as a kid?
Yeah, for sure. In the sense that I, again, could tell you that there was something wrong, but I couldn't understand what was wrong. So that led to this kind of feeling that there was, again, something not quite right within my body. That took me a long time to kind of express and figure out why. And let's say once it all clicked, it was like, oh, okay, well, that's what it is, and now it's
was
very
that
much
kind of a liberating realization?
Yes, in the sense that I understood where those thoughts and feelings came from. No, in the sense that you still experience those thoughts and feelings, and you kind of have to sit with them and kind of work through them. but at least now there's an insight of not getting caught up by them, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Did you find, because for me personally, I actually found that when I was growing up in Hong Kong specifically, I know other Chinese people have different experience, that gender, kind of performative gender expression was actually much less restrictive or limited in my upbringing. And I found that coming to Australia, all of a sudden I found the specifically Anglo kind of expectations of gendered behavior to be quite restricting. And then it's kind of, what gets folded into that is kind of the kind of racist ideas about Asian men or being not masculine. So it's very complicated for a lot of Asian people, I find, because it's not just kind of upbringing, it's also a racial aspect folded into it. It's curious to hear how, for your experience, it was kind of more in Mexico that you found it kind of a more prescriptive gender expression or behavior and roles, and then in Australia
yes, with the caveat that I think within Mexican culture and history, just as there is gender normativity, there's also a lot of space to undermine and expand kind of notions of gender and what gender is.
Do you think a lot of it is actually European colonization ideas more than kind of traditional indigenous ideas?
Yeah, well, that's a let's say a complex question and a very enriching one, in the sense that there's definitely traditions within Mexico, and the very famous example is Zapotec communities who have this quote unquote kind of third gender called mushes, and within the notion of mushe and what it means to be mushe, it's just so much more expansive than, let's say, trans, non-binary, gender diverse notions of what it means to be, gender diverse, in the sense that, mushe kind of speaks to almost an embodied kind of femininity, regardless of whether that person, has medical affirmation or surgical affirmation or presents in this way or the other way. It's very much about how you feel internally, but also the role that you play within that community and within that culture throughout. So kind of, in a way, the English LGBTQIA plus community was a bit of a stepping stone to rediscover and reconnect with those elements that perhaps growing up were still very hidden to me or were inaccessible to me. And I remember going back to Mexico after being in Australia for 10 years and like stepping into a queer space and just being so overwhelmed with joy, because it felt like all the bits of myself were just there. And all the people, the shared experience, even the art on the wall spoke to my own experience. We're a very Catholic country, and in this particular like queer space, it's Catholic themed. So you walk in and there's murals of two priests in kind of a homoerotic type of insinuation, and two nuns in a very kind of sapphic depiction, and it spoke to all of those things that were there growing up, but I couldn't really express, and all of a sudden I had this kind of shared vivid language for it. So reconciling those two elements was
so you didn't necessarily need to search for it just came popping out of you when you returned.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely. Like once I returned to Mexico and I had an opportunity to reconnect with my country and culture throughout. One of the first people that I reconnected with was a friend from primary school who had also very recently come out as non-binary, and we were like chatting about all of our experiences growing up and recognizing that kind of we were there all the time. It just we didn't necessarily have a frame of reference for connecting until then.
I feel like we can talk about this forever, but let's talk more about your experience with your family. How did you go about kind of inviting your family into this kind of new understanding of yourself?
Yeah.
I don't want to use the word coming out because I feel like that kind of sets a very specific Western narrative to it. So I want you to just
Yeah. No,
express that however
yeah,
you want.
I can appreciate that because it does kind of problematize the way that we navigate those relationships. And I think like, mom and dad, I think, exemplify that quite well in the sense that within, I think, a few months of kind of realizing throughout, I just told my mom. And it was a fairly, at least I remember it being a fairly emotional kind of statement, and it felt like a lot of these feelings that I had kept inside all of a sudden came kind of pouring out, and it just was what it was. And I think, as with any kind of queer child, the fear of rejection, of parental rejection, is always there. So I think a lot of what was expressed and a lot of the overwhelm, a lot of the big emotions were, in a way, that fear. And thankfully, I had a very kind of supportive journey in that aspect. With my dad, on the other hand, it operated in a more, let's say, typically Mexican or kind of Latino narrative, in the sense that I didn't actually tell him until, I think, 10 years down the track. So I kept it hidden from view. And that was a very conscious decision. Again, part of it due to fear of parental rejection and him not understanding where I was coming from. What I can say is, once I did kind of express this, and I did express it relatively kind of matter of fact throughout, I didn't really give him an opportunity to respond per se. I just kind of put it out on the table, and thankfully, again, he took it. He took his time to digest whatever he had to digest across, and then it was never spoken about again. But it was never challenged or questioned or pushed back. It was just kind of, again, an unspoken thing that was there. It was on the table and it was plainly visible and stated. And again, we both know that we know, but it's not necessarily something that's talked about.
Has he read your poems?
He's definitely witnessed my poems, in the sense that he's come to poetry readings, so he definitely knows what the poetry is about. Whether or not he's responded to them or not.
Do you see, like, is there any like signs from, I don't know, his facial expression when you're reading them, or like afterwards his behavior? Do you think that has clicked to some of the childhood experiences?
I think it's similarly to kind of the coming out experience. I think it's all navigated in silences. The different thing about it is that the silences became softer. In the sense,
there's less tension in those silences.
Yeah, absolutely. In the sense that when growing up, there was that sensation of, coldness and again, that kind of fear of rejection and that sense of kind of difference. And as time goes by, there's still silence, but it's very soft. There's the space in there for my partner to come to dinner, or for small talks here and there, and for moments of acknowledgement that still operate within silence, but don't
may not be verbal, but like it's expressed in its own way. I think that's very common for a lot of us diaspora community. It's not necessarily explicitly spoken, but I think what you choose to spend your time witnessing your child says a lot about what you accept and support. It may not be explicit verbal affirmation, but whether you show up, whether you support in that way can mean a lot in our cultures. Yeah. But I just want to contrast that to your relationship with your mom. I've only met her this afternoon, but I can see how warm that relationship is. And I'm glad that you had kind of that really supportive and warm, embracing reaction to your coming out, and it's been a very affirming relationship and experience for you.
Yeah, yes, it has been. And I think part of it is also growing up. My mom was also exposed to, let's say, the queer community, in the sense that other close family members growing up, she witnessed the HIV crisis kind of go through, even though in this small town in Mexico, and she witnessed the treatment of people and what they had to go through. So I don't think it was something new. It's something that had also been part of her lived experience, I suppose, growing up.
Yeah, I remember growing up in Hong Kong, late 80s, early 90s, there was a real air of hysteria around AIDS and HIV. And I think what you observe your families, how they respond to those issues really informs you about whether they will be accepting of you. And was there any key moments in your childhood in observing how your mom would react to these issues that kind of told you how she would respond to you coming out?
I think it was more hearing the stories about how she navigated this, I guess, close relationship with the family member, because I never got the sense that there was rejection. I got the sense that...
Or was there another family member that was
that's
part of the
right.
queer community?
Alfredo, que era tu primo?
Freddy.
Sí. Her cousin, who were growing up around the same kind of age. I vaguely remember actually being quite young and attending the funeral for this kind of family member, but I must have been, again, quite young, if around at all. And again, I never got the sense that there was rejection. I got the sense of sadness for how he was treated. So there was that warmth, I suppose, or at least that compassion and that understanding of, who he was had nothing to do, and his suffering on what he lived through had nothing to do with who he was. It was more about how he was treated that shaped a lot of that negative experience.
So this was how old are you around?
Oh, I must have been at the very, when he passed away, I must have been quite young, I don't know, 3 or 4 or something. If at all, I might be, again, misremembering.
But it is I can tell that it's a very vivid experience.
Yeah. And certainly, let's say when I was a little bit older, but still within that space of childhood, again, I can remember my mom mentioning those experiences, or those kind of histories. So let's say
So she always spoke with compassion and understanding.
Yeah, I would say, or at least that had a positive feeling around how this was what had happened. So when it was time to come out, I had that to fall back to, or at least that kind of history to fall back to. And I knew that, again, it wasn't something that was new or that she hadn't experienced or get exposure to before.
I think that's a good time to invite your mom into this conversation. Welcome, Karina.
Thank you.
You've been listening to what Asiel has said just off camera before. Is there anything you'd like to say to Asiel?
Yes, that's I got my attention that he mentioned it when we lost my cousin Freddy. It was very. I was surprised that he still remember the fact when he passed away. So.
Feel free to use Spanish.
Okay. Me llamó mucho la atención de que así él haya recordado cuando murió mi primo, y como dice él, fue un acontecimiento muy triste. Él era de mi edad y quisiera contarte la historia porque nosotros crecimos juntos, toda la primaria, era como mi hermano. Cuando él iba en la secundaria, él era un poco afeminado, así, muy afeminado para ser hombre, lo cual era inaceptable en esa época.
Entonces mi tío, o sea, su papá, dijo que él era así porque se juntaba mucho conmigo, porque jugábamos siempre juntos, porque él había aprendido esos modales de mi parte. Y entonces dijo, no se va a juntar más con Karina, los tenemos que separar porque él necesita ser hombre.
As my mom was saying, it was something that kind of shook the family, in the sense that mom and Freddy, who is her cousin, grew up together. They were the same age, so they grew up together all throughout primary school. And Freddy was very effeminate, and let's say behaved or performed femininity in ways that weren't kind of acceptable for kind of young men in our small town. So my mom's uncle, Freddie's dad, blamed this on the fact that he spent too much time with his cousins who were girls, and therefore needed to separate them. So he kind of would grow up to be more masculine and to be a man. And that's what we're up to.
Fue muy difícil para mí que nos separaran y yo no entendía nada. Yo decía, siempre ha sido así. O sea, ¿por qué lo tienen que alejar? ¿Por qué lo tratan de educar? ¿O por qué lo tratan de cambiar de una manera que tiene que ser de acuerdo a los estándares de mi tío? Entonces, yo pienso que también fue difícil para él porque él empezó a juntarse, vamos a decirlo, con malas compañías, entre comillas, o sea, personas que obviamente con otras personas de la comunidad LGBT. Y bueno, empezó a tomar y empezó a tener algunos problemas. Y después, pues nos juntábamos de vez en cuando para ir a bailar, a la disco, y me acuerdo que tomaba mucho.
As she was saying, after they were separated, which my mom at that age couldn't understand why he had to be separated or why he had to kind of conform to what my uncle perceived was, the correct way of being or the correct way of performing masculinity. She couldn't understand why that had to be done and why that had to be the case. And she's reflecting on the fact that it probably also had a big impact on him as a person. As they kind of grew apart from this separation, he started, I guess, exploring and being close to other aspects of the LGBTQIA plus community who, let's say, were also a bit fraught. There were some substance issues. And as they grew older, she recalls going out with them, and he would kind of just drink a lot or drink in excess to, I guess, cope with what was happening.
And how much contact did he have with his family at that point?
He was 6 years old. Asiel was 6 years
Oh,
old.
I mean,
No, Freddy.
I mean
Freddy?
Sí, después de que lo separaron, como que se mantuvo cerca de la familia, como cuál era el contacto que tuvo con la familia.
No,
después.
siempre, porque siempre vivió con mi tía y con mi tío. O sea, sí. He always been he always was in the family, in the nucleo, but he was never accepted, because I remember my auntie trying to telling him, "Yo, don't do that," or please behave well. He cannot be like he wanted to be.
yeah.
I was really sad because I don't understand why, if her mom is the person who needs to protect him, I can imagine how he feels. I can imagine. So also my uncle, he was a big problem. He never accepted that he was gay, never ever. So for my point of view, he suffered a lot. he suffered a lot. I am talking about around the 80s. At the end of the day, he died. He died from SIDA. He was so sad when he was 30 years old. Yeah, I think he didn't have the education that he should. It was a very close form of thinking how you should be.
So coming back to Asiel, when he was growing up, did you have any kind of indication that he may be queer?
Yes, I have had some indication. Yeah, I think because it's probably mom intuition.
Yes.
Yeah. I remember when he was in the kindergarten, he has a friend. I don't know if you remember your friend Julio Cesar.
Oh no, another one.
He was 3 years old.
Yeah.
When I picked him up from the kindergarten, the teacher used to say, "Oh, I don't know why he always wants to be with Julio Cesar." And I thought, sounds very suspicious. Yeah, he was. I noticed he was feeling attracted for men. For example, my daughter is very flirtatious. You see when she's trying to be nice with the opposite sex, and he was with the same sex. Yeah,
that's interesting. But you didn't kind of realize this about yourself, or are you surprised to hear that?
I am and I'm not in a way, in the sense that I again kind of struggle to kind of pick up on like why people's perceptions are the way they are, and in my head it was just me, I suppose. And it's been interesting kind of reflecting back on these experiences, and again having that feeling that there was difference there, but not knowing why or what was the context, or it was a sense of rejection or being treated differently without knowing why. And that, let's say, growing up led to a sense of hurt and shame, but not knowing why there was hurt and shame, if that makes sense. So part of me is not surprised, but the other part of me is also a bit perplexed. Yes.
And was there other signs that you saw about his gender identity of being non-binary?
I suspect something was not quite right. I think it was una época. One period of time that he was very, isolated. He used to be in her room all the time.
Right. As in not quite right in terms of mental health.
Exactly. Right, wearing black all the time.
Right.
I said, why you are wearing black all the time? I think was just trying to find himself. Try to struggle with all these things you have to cope with.
Yeah.
But I didn't know what to do.
Well, it sounds like your behavior or your compassion towards your cousin already kind of spoke a lot to Asiel, in that he knew that he was safe with you. He never doubted that he wouldn't be safe with you. But in Mexico, so you never pushed him or kind of tried to nudge kind of Asiel as to talking about this issue when you were back in Mexico, even though you kind of had some kind of inkling that there could be something that was upsetting or distressing to him.
No idea. Yeah. Also, my husband is very strict, and when I say,
You say in Spanish.
yes, I lost my
Yeah.
Mi esposo es un poco rígido, es un poco estricto, muy, muy apegado a sus tradiciones, a las reglas, a las cosas como deberían de ser. Y no lo culpo porque mi suegro es el típico macho mexicano, patriarca, que solo sus ideas son las correctas y las cosas son así porque así deben de ser, porque ha sido en todas las generaciones. Y quieras o no, nos vemos influenciada por esas creencias, por esa forma de pensar. Siento que es como una sombra que nos pesa, porque sí, es muy duro. O sea, es muy, 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 mi suegro es muy, muy, muy estricto, muy, muy hombre, según él, que obviamente mi esposo creció con todas estas cuestiones, viendo todo esto.
As my mom was saying, my dad had very rigid ways of thinking and kind of seeing the world, and things are as they should be. So it was very difficult to have those conversations. And as she was saying, this kind of comes from his upbringing, because my grandfather, my dad's dad, is a very kind of typical, traditional, kind of patriarchal, who, his way of thinking is the only way of thinking, and it should be that way because that's the way that it has been, for generations. And he is very rigid and inflexible, I guess, in his way of seeing the world, even until now. So she can't blame or put fault on how he was raised and how he was influenced by, the context in which we grew up, which is, again, very traditional, rural kind of Mexico.
Yes, I need to add that my husband has been changing a lot. It's not the same like he was years ago. I think education is the key. Education definitely is the key. Is where Asiel showed me and how to learn more about the LGBTB community. And I think we are afraid of the unknown, and we are hard to accept that things that we perceive like is not normal. I hate this word normal, because what is normal?
Yes.
So, oh my goodness.
I try to never use normal.
Yeah. I also I think it's not a good word. The education has been helped a lot to accept Asiel's preference. I prefer to say this in Spanish. Okay. Pienso que la educación es clave para comprender a nuestros hijos y a la comunidad LGTB+. Si la gente tuviera acceso a estos recursos y se interesara un poquito más de lo que es comprender a sus hijos, o sea, ahorita hay mucha información que antes no había. Entonces pienso que no hay excusa como para no aceptar que nuestros hijos pertenecen a la comunidad LGTB+. So, pienso que Asiel ha hecho un buen papel en este aspecto de educarnos en todo este proceso.
And was this something that Asiel brought to you, or brought kind of material for you, or did you go out and try to find, seek out resources for yourself?
He brings resources. Yeah, he brings resources. Yeah.
I think from observing how you kind of showed compassion to Freddie, your cousin, I think he knew that you would have an open mind and he could have an honest communication with you, and that you would have the mindset to encounter the education and learn from the resources. I think there's a lot of kids or young people out there in our diaspora community where we feel like I don't know if it's always true that their parents or our parents is already going to react in a negative way, that we never kind of make the effort to try to make them understand. And I can 100% understand why they would be like that. But that's why it's so important, like, for parents, for you to have kind of express a position of openness and compassion, so that Asiel knew that he could come to you. I want to come back to how Asiel shared their sexuality and gender with you. What can you remember about that experience?
I remember I was cooking. I was just my onion. And Asiel came and said, "Mom, I need to talk with you." I was in a hurry, but for me, my priority always has been my kids. And I put my cooking aside and I said, "Okay, soy todo oídos," dijo el burro. And he told me, "Mom, I am gay. I am." And I remember he started to cry. And I said, "Oh, Mom, are you sure?" But I feel like, oh my goodness, he's suffering. Obviously, as a man, when you see your son suffering, you suffer as well. So at the beginning was like a cascade of emotions. What is going to happen to him? He's going to get married. He's going to have a kid. He's going to have a family like he always dreamed for the family. And this is the thing I was worried about. I never worry about her preference or his preference. My only worry was if he was able to be happy. I saw Asiel very happy now, that if you see how much love he has with his partner, I have never seen in another person, in another even couples. I am really proud of him. I'm very satisfied how he had been growing up in all the aspects of his life. Yeah, the worries disappear.
Yeah, I think from my experience, like a lot of Chinese families, they will say, you know, yes, I want you to be happy, I want you to be healthy and successful. But I think the best way for you to be that is to not be gay or openly identify as gay.
Okay.
How did you, like for yourself in Asiel's case, how did you come to realizing that being open and Asiel openly identifying and living a life that is, you know, true to his gender and sexual identity was the best life that he could live?
You see him every day. He's being authentic, because it's really hard to wear a mask all the time and not be yourself. And I noticed that he is doing what makes him happy, and he doesn't bother about the opinion of people's opinion. Also, I don't bother for me, because in one point, if I go to Mexico, they are very, very discriminate against the
Queer people.
the queer people, really, really. And I have to choose between people or my son. So obviously I choose my son. If they say whatever they want to say, I don't mind. Okay? I need to protect my son against everyone. Yeah.
And did you notice a kind of a change in your relationship before and after he shared that about himself to you?
We were more close. definitely this fact nos unió.
And I think I also didn't give options in a way, in the sense that I was, I felt like I've never necessarily compromised myself to fit into expectations. Once, I guess, that knowledge was there, it was just there. But yeah, it did start to kind of create more of a relationship and kind of build those bridges. Because we had just moved to Australia, so I think for a very long time there wasn't any other family around, you know. So it's been a process of also rebuilding those kind of connections, and not only with you, but also with like dad and my sister, and then family back home in Mexico, and navigating the whole process with them, and building.
How long before, like, so you told your mom when you were around, like when you first went to university, or around like
No,
high school?
No,
Just
he was
sometime.
still in high school.
Yeah, either like 18 maybe.
Yeah, he was studying the last year of the high
Right.
school, around 18 probably.
Yep, yep.
Yes.
And clearly before you introduced any partners to your...
We are complices.
Yes.
We can say partner in crime.
Crime.
Yeah, we were partner in crime because I was who was driving to see his partner.
Oh yeah. That's. I mean, that's when I was like 20-ish. Yeah, that's right, with Josh. I forgot about that. Forgot about Josh.
And did you...
Makeup lessons. Ay, mijo. A mother's love sublimates violence the way winter gives birth to spring. Don't you know, your body is not a war. Here, start with the foundations. Begin by erasing any trace of hurt the world might have left on you. Imagine a face with no borders, quiet as a field with no names in it. Carve your cheeks from achiote and mole rojo. Repaint the history of our country as if it never belonged to the rage of violent men. But mijo, a brush can be as violent as a knife. Treat it with care. You will soon learn that the pain of walking in heels is the pain of learning to stand tall. That a broken lip deserves to be dressed in red as though it's never kissed the pavement. Some days this dress will feel so bone close and heavy you will mistake its stitches for skin. Ay, mijo, when you walk down the street with the heaviness of names that do not belong to you, remember you were made from women who have been painting flowers on the faces of skulls for years.
I remember when I first read that, it was so moving and it was so powerful yet tender. It just really moved me. Do you remember when you first read Asiel's poem, this particular poem?
Yes, I was really surprised because I feel so honored that she mentioned his mom and the way that she mentioned, because he loves to do the makeup, and I said, I can teach you. Yes, and he wrote beautiful in a poem that really was break my heart of happiness. I really enjoy a lot.
It's both heartbreaking and so affirming and so affirming and cathartic, I think, to hear. Actually, when I read it, it kind of reminded me of this memory that I almost forgotten for many years, was that my mom used to put makeup on me when I was like 6, 7.
Uh-huh.
And then also when I did, theatre in high school, she would always be one of the moms that volunteered to do the makeup on us. And because I went to an all-boys school, I often played a female part.
Okay.
So yeah, reading that poem just like brought back all those memories for me when I read it. And I feel like the voice in that is so interesting. I feel like it works on so many different ways. Like it feels like your mom saying that to you, but also feels like you saying it to yourself, or you saying it to other gender diverse people as well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the process or the thinking behind it was very much reclaiming that, or sitting with the fact that growing up, I felt most of the strength and resilience come from femininity and feminine figures around it. I really didn't care much or connect with masculinity and the performance of masculinity within Mexico. It felt like a very violent place, and it felt like a place that was not for me. But the way that I saw femininity, in particular Mexican femininity, I just felt very familiar and felt very much kind of at peace and very, grounded and affirming. And it took a long time to express where that was coming from. So it was as much as, let's say, an affirmation of that Mexican femininity that I saw growing up, as well as an affirmation of myself and saying there's space within this for me. Yes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And is there anything else you want to say to Asiel about the poem, Karina?
Yes. Asiel, en tu poema dice, el amor de una madre sublima la violencia. ¿En qué te inspiraste para escribir esas líneas?
So Mom's making reference to one of the opening lines in the poem that states, mother's love sublimates violence the same way winter gives birth to spring. And she's asking about the inspiration for the line. And it's funny because it's almost I pinched it from Ocean Vuong in the sense that there's a poem that he writes called Head First that also kind of deals with in this instance violence and trauma that his mother went through in the Vietnam War, and how that led to him as a person and him who he is. And the resilience that his mother showed, and that a lot of the women in his family overall, or in his lineage, showed. And I suppose how that lineage and how that resilience is then, kind of echoed in his queerness and survival as a, kind of queer person of color across. So that line made echoes and made a reference to that particular poem, because I think Ocean Vuong and his first collection influenced a lot of this poetry in particular. And in the notes also states that, that line in particular makes a reference to Head First. So even though it's a very different lived experience, it echoes similar themes.
I think that sort of experience of kind of identifying with more the women in the family is a very common thing a lot of us gay people do feel. And I certainly feel that as well. When I look at my family, it's certainly a lot of the women that I kind of feel a closer kinship with. I think, it's not just personal, but it's something that a lot of us feel in the community.
Yeah.
En tu poema hay un párrafo también que dice, habrá días que este vestido se sentirá pesado y cerca del hueso. Mi pregunta es, ¿has sentido o sientes pesado pertenecer a la comunidad LGBTIQ+?
Yeah. So Mom was asking about the line in the poem that states, the dress will feel so bone close and heavy, and whether or not that reflects a sense of burden, perhaps, in belonging to the queer community. I didn't necessarily write it from that angle, but more so from the comfort, I guess, that being able to embody one's gender in a way that becomes most natural, has that naturalness, that sensation of how identity can kind of attach itself to the body and the way that identity is played out. In regards to feeling a burden within the LGBTQIA community, I think it's complex because as any community, there's obviously nuanced dynamics within the LGBTQIA plus community that can make it challenging at times. And I mean, I certainly noticed when I moved from Melbourne to Sydney, where Sydney was a bit more, I don't want to use the word superficial, but I guess superficial is the best kind of summary of it. It is a bit more looks oriented, and there was definitely, it brought up a lot of difficult emotions in both how I felt within my body and how my body was perceived or responded to within, quote unquote, kind of queer spaces. And, that has its own set of challenges across. I think there's definitely a lot of our community that could be kinder to one another and to ourselves.
It's always like this queer phobia of, it's kind of, we internalize all that kind of trauma that a lot of us received as in our childhood as well.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly stepping into kind of queer spaces when I was younger felt very daunting and it brought up a lot of difficult emotions, because all of that rejection and all of that sense of not belonging or not being worthy of belonging or not being worthy of being there, kind of came up whenever you stepped into these spaces. But at the same time, it is, at the end of the day, like also the space that I feel most embraced by. So I suppose it's kind of work that we have to do both within ourselves as an individual, so we don't replicate those dynamics when we are in these spaces, and then as a community, constantly thinking about the way that we could be kind of kinder to one another, more compassionate to one another, because I think it's very easy to just let yourself get carried on by this, feelings and emotions, and not open up the inclusiveness of space that we sometimes so desperately kind of need. Yes.
Now, I'd like to go back to you sharing who you are with your father and your extended family in Mexico, and how your relationship with community and culture evolved. So how long after telling your mom before you decided it was time to share who you are with your father?
It took 10 years for me to actually explicitly tell him. But I'm not sure if Dad actually
Did he ever ask you?
suspected or clocked it beforehand, because again...
Did he talk to you about that during those 10 years?
I was trying to educate him.
Lay the groundwork first.
Exactly. And after I said, Asiel, you can tell to your dad. But Asiel, I don't mind.
Yeah, that's true. At some stage, my mom did say you can tell your dad if you want to.
Yeah.
And then I thought, I don't think I do, in the sense that I didn't think our relationship necessarily was at the point where it would change anything. And I eventually did come out to my dad, again on my own terms, and I didn't really give him any options around it. And then started to kind of, again, build that relationship and build that reconnection in a way. But for a very long time, I didn't think I would necessarily ever come out to my dad, or would take, much longer. Because I didn't, again, want to conform to that idea of coming out, and if it wasn't gonna necessarily make a change in our relationship, then why would you? Until eventually it became kind of necessary. And that's when I told him. And I guess same with the family in Mexico. It was kind of an active reconnection to tell them, to form that bridge again between culture and family that had been separated by 10 years by that stage. And that was also quite a healing experience, to be able to tell my extended family, and have that kind of implicit acceptance.
And was that so? You told your dad, and then pretty much very close after you told your extended family. Is that right?
I think so, because I think it must have been in like 2000 and just before we went to Mexico, like 2016ish.
And did you have to do any work with the extended family after Asiel told them? Did you find there was resistance or anything like that?
For my family, I am just talking of my side. No resistance at all, nothing at all, any comment at all. And I talk very familiar with my auntie, with my sister about Asiel and his partner, and always talking about both. And no, I think everybody accepted.
Do you think? Sorry.
I was gonna say, yeah, that's actually, yeah. I don't recall necessarily having that conversation with your side of the family, but when we went to Mexico, like last year, your aunties were, have always been very welcoming, and they're kind of a generation above, or they would be my grandma's age.
Ah, right.
And yeah, they were still, again, very welcoming. They've met my partners, and they're always, yeah. Again, it's that implicit acceptance where it's not stated, but it's also, not questioned or not pushed back or not resisted. It's just that partners invited to the family dinner,
Do you think partly it's because your mom was just a strong supporter or advocate for you? They could see and they know that you've been open with your mom for so long, and they could see that there was just acceptance and support there and embrace there?
I suppose so. And there's also, no sé cómo, si tal vez la experiencia con Freddy cambió un poco de sus opiniones o formó tal vez una de sus opiniones.
I don't think so. I think I want to think it's like, okay, I talk with my family with so much naturality, like it's like talking for any people that they just don't say anything. It's like Asiel says implicit acceptance. I probably both, yeah, contribute to. He were very welcome. Yeah.
What about on
No judge, no criticize, no nothing, no nagging, because sometimes why you don't say anything? No, nothing. Yeah.
But do they kind of know you to be very protective of your children as well? Is that
Yeah. Probably. Yeah.
What about on your father's side?
On my dad's side, I'd really had the conversation with my cousins, really. I don't recall having the conversation with any of my other uncles and aunties, even though there's a lot of them. And from there, I think it just kind of snowballed in the sense that once I had the conversation with my cousins, then they told, my aunts and uncles and, my grandma. And I remember you mentioned that my grandma kind of knew that, I had a partner, and she just said, that's the way it is, that's the way it is. I think my grandfather is the only person literally out of like the whole family that still doesn't know. And again, I think I'm at the stage where if that comes from, a very traditional way of thinking and viewing the world, I'm not necessarily there to challenge that. I'm happy to just live it as is. And again, I think it would probably damage the relationship more than actually help it. So I'm happy to leave him in his worldview and kind of like lead my own life without any.
I guess, yeah, so overwhelmingly, most of the family knows and supports you, so...
Yeah, I would say so. And yeah, and I mean, I think from both sides, perhaps from my dad's side in particular, I'm like the first grandson, so there's a lot of cultural significance to it. So
Yes.
I think there's also a bit of a benefit or privilege that comes in with that, because it just is what it is. Yeah.
From my humble opinion, I think they love him so much. They love Asiel so much that doesn't matter anything. Yeah, I think the love is predominant. Yeah,
Stronger than
it's
any
stronger
other.
than any barriers or any prejuicios.
Prejudice.
Or prejudice. And
That's great to know. But I do think your fears your fear support has a lot to do with it. I think in Chinese families as well. I think you by yourself doing anything, it's not legitimized. I feel in Chinese culture until like your parents kind of stand behind you and support you. Then people was like, okay. Someone was just telling me this transgender woman. She just came from Shanghai, and she says that in China, to be able to access transgender treatment, your parents had to sign,
Even for adults.
even for adults.
wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think in Chinese, a lot of diaspora communities, your parents' public support still means a lot for whether the community views you as still being in the community and will recognize whatever identity or that you want to express.
Oh, is there something you want to ask Asiel in Spanish? Yes, please go ahead.
¿Cómo tuviste que lidiar entre querer ser auténtico y complacer a la familia, sobre todo a tus abuelitos, a que se sintieran orgullosos de ti? Porque por un lado tienes que cumplir con ciertas expectativas, pero por el otro tienes que defender lo tuyo.
Mom's asking how I was able to navigate family expectations and, kind of maintaining both those connections and I suppose what's expected to perform in these, family spaces, while at the same time being, true and authentic to yourself and remaining, I guess, steadfast in who you are as a person. Which is, again, I think is a question that a lot of people within the queer community grapple with, that tension of fulfilling family expectations and wanting to be the offspring that their parents or family wanted and envisioned for them versus living their kind of own authentic life.
I think there's also a lot of pressure from mainstream queer community or to kind of pressure us to be quote unquote more authentic in our cultural communities, but it's a lot of pressure for for people that's trying to maintain a connection to the cultural community and the culture, and then having this whole second kind of duty to the queer community of flying the flag. It's a lot of pressure, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's expectations on both parts, and the reality is that there's not, within the family, there's aspects of myself that are never going to be visible to them, and that's okay, and that I choose not to, let's say, be fully visible in. I don't know who I am as a person, my desires, my wants, my places where I go, my joys, my etc. across. What I choose to share with them. Thankfully, I am at the point of my life where I can choose that very carefully and with lots of consideration and with a sense of inviting them in rather than, having to do it on their terms. On the other hand, similarly, there's aspects of the queer community and cultural aspects of the community that, you know, are never going to be fully understood or seen. So there's this, in a way, sense of incompleteness in both. But at the same time, that's where, I guess, an internal sense of completedness or wholeness becomes quite important, because if I know where I'm coming from, and if I know who I am as a person, and if I'm secure within that, then everything else becomes a lot more manageable, because everything that's shared or everything that's met or not met, I know comes from a deep sense of self and respect of who I am, and everything is done within my boundaries and comforts, rather than being forced to do X, Y, Z, or being forced to perform certain expectations from either the queer community or, you know, within the family. I know who I am as a person, and whatever other expectations are not met are for them to deal with, you know, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense to me. And also, I think it's important to remind people we are different people in different contexts and different circles. I think it's a lot to put on us as queer people. It's like, you have to be as queer as you are on Oxford Street as, you know, when you're in a home cultural context. Like, I want to kind of enjoy another aspect of myself when I'm in with my family as I'm with my friends. I think we need to give ourselves permissions to be different people in different circumstances. Like, obviously hiding yourself is not good, but I think being queer in your family and cultural community can look quite different sometimes. And doing kind of being queer, or actually kind of being proud of your queerness in that context, can look quite different compared to, let's say, in the workplace, or like, you know, in the mainstream queer community. And I think we should let ourselves kind of explore ourselves, like, to be in a queer and different way within those contexts. You know?
Yeah, and I do have to say, it does take time to know where those kind of boundaries are, you know, because I think you can only approach those spaces from once you have that kind of internal sense of completedness, I suppose, or integration or togetherness. I think it's hard to do when you're younger. And that's where I think a lot of the pressures can really feel quite difficult to navigate, when, you know, perhaps I felt quite hurt by the fact that I couldn't show, or I perceived that I couldn't show certain aspects of myself to my family. And nothing has changed really. Like, nothing has changed in what I share or how I present myself at family dinners, I suppose. But internally, I know that I don't owe it to them to share it per se. And I also know that if I share it, I know that it'll be also well received. So, but that can only come, I think, with time.
Yeah, it does come with time. Yeah.
And I know that you just mentioned again, when you were growing up, you felt that kind of almost oppressive expectation, gender expectation. And when you returned in that trip to tell your extended family, did that give you a different perspective or way of seeing Mexican culture this time? That
100%. I again remember going back and being in Mexico again, and first of all realizing that this is where I'm from, and this is where I belong, and this is what actually feels like home. Like, as soon as I landed in Mexico, it just felt so familiar and so affirming. And there are still a lot of moments, even in today, where I just miss that Mexicanness and that culture and that connection to, like, the places and the people and the food and the everything about it. And in that first trip, I also realized that, you know, Mexican culture has changed a long way from when I was growing up, where, you know, a lot more visible now, and we're expanding kind of notions of queerness both within our, like, own culture and country, but also outside of it. And to me, there's, like, nothing more affirming than seeing those queer Mexican spaces where it all just kind of comes together. And for example, the artist who did the cover, Fabian Chaires, has been reclaiming a lot of Mexican imagery that's both Catholic, that's both indigenous, that's classically Mexican, and really resubverting it and doing some wonderful, interesting things that speak to this shared experience. Like he has a series of young kids or children crying on the soccer field, and these beautiful, beautiful kind of Baroque paintings, just capturing this image where I feel like a lot of queer people in Mexico just resonate with that failure of masculinity and feeling the sports field as a place where that would often kind of play out. Or, lucha libre and queering a lot of those scenes where, it kind of becomes a masculine drag or a kind of draggy performance of masculinity that's very uniquely Mexican, but also like instantly recognizable, So it opened up my own understanding of my own culture and made me realize that there is space for me. So every time I go back, it again just feels so much like home.
And how much do you think the Mexican or generally Latino community in Australia connects with that kind of new wave of new ideas around queerness?
It's really hard because I don't think there's a lot of Mexican community here. It's very hard to actually find Mexican community, period. There's a growing, Latin American, Latinx, Hispanic kind of community, but that comes from a lot of places within Latin America. And while we have that shared language and some cultural shared aspects, I think our own notions of queerness are somewhat kind of different. And that's why whenever I meet a queer Mexican person, it's just such a close connection, because it's a connection not only to queerness, but country and culture and what that feels like and language, and being able to talk about all those shared experiences and being understood implicitly. Yeah.
And while you're in Australia, have you found kind of connection with other Latino queer people or artists, not necessarily Mexican, that you've kind of found a connection with?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of people from Colombia and Chile and Venezuela and Brazil that there's been that shared connection. And I think we, through that shared language, and I guess through that shared colonial history, there's a lot of shared lived experience. So it's also been quite affirming seeing spaces within Australia, within the LGBTQIA+ community here, that are now making more space for, Spanish-speaking countries or Spanish-speaking people or Latin American people, and creating a little bit more of that connection back to home.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave it, and also for people to do their further exploration on themselves by themselves. And is there anything you want to say before we finish, Karina?
My last message is to the other parents is no limiten su felicidad.
Yeah, sorry, I'm thinking about how to translate it.
Mi mensaje es a los papás que por favor no limiten su felicidad a los hijos. La vida es corta y ellos merecen ser felices, siendo auténticos, siendo como son.
The last message is for parents not to limit the joy of their children, to, I suppose, realize that life is short and they deserve to have a full and open life, and not to limit their happiness.
And that's all.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah. Such a beautiful
Thank you.
conversation.
Oh, we did it.
Very honored to have captured.
And just welcome everyone.
Thank you for listening to this conversation with Dr. Asiel Sanchez and their mom, Karina, part of our community storytelling project, Stories of Coming Out and Coming Home. Special thanks to Asiel's sister and her husband for hosting the conversation at their home in Naarm, Melbourne. Thank you to Matthew Smallwood, our recordist, videographer and editor, and Mark Chamberlain for composing the beautiful music for our project. And thank you to the City of Sydney for funding this project. I'm Victor Wu, a gay storyteller of Chinese and Tuju Malaysian heritage. This podcast is produced on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Sovereignty was never ceded. Please subscribe and follow our Instagram at comingout.cominghome for more moving stories of family embrace and joining the conversation. And please get in touch if you want to share your own story of coming out and coming home.